Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Welcome back. This is the ninth lecture in this course of International Relations, and we have so far had a terrific journey, a very interesting journey in looking at what IR is from the time it began as an academic discipline in 1919 to where we are right now. IR has opened up to be an area of exciting conflicting, interesting issues ranging from conservation of the environment to protecting whales, to the International Red Cross, to patriarchy, to domestic work, to everyday lives of consumption, to the shoes that we wear, to the decisions that we make, and finally, it raises questions about who controls our lives at a time where technology has become extremely pervasive and influential, whether it is the influence of bodies such as Facebook or whether it is national governments. The critical question then is of the individual and the world. So IR allows us to look at the multiple forms of engagement between the individual, between the boundaries that he's kept within or bounded by international organizations, states, and it is a very rich, complex domain of academic inquiry. Now, in the previous lecture, we have looked at IOs, international organizations, and we have seen as to how IOs have multiplied in the 20th century to a point that they now exercise a great degree of control and influence in international politics. Certain scholars view this positively and argue that IOs are part of the globalization debate. Others are not so sure about the impact these international organizations have, especially those which have influential reach in finance, where they influence migration and where they push the gap between the global rich and the global poor. So we come to a crucial question in today's class, and that is the question of globalization. And globalization itself is positioned as a debate. The debate is centered upon the nature of this globalization, the beneficiaries of this globalization, the objective of this globalization, and therefore it is quite legitimate to see a debate between skeptics of globalization and proponents of globalization. And in today's class, we're going to start off by looking at what do we mean by globalization, and who are the people who are supporting it and why, and who are the people who are critical of it and why. So first things first, the book that I'm referring to is David Hell's classic text on globalization, Global Transformations, and the title is indicative of globalizing being an ongoing process. It is an ongoing process, and David Hell tells us that globalization can be, of course, he's summarizing people who have debated, have written about globalization. So he's summarizing arguments, and he argues that globalization is fundamentally about action at a distance, which means that things which are at a very great distance can now be moved easily, and the reference here is to technology, the internet, and as to how things can now move at a faster pace than ever before. So, the first component is that of time and space compression, where things, objects, people move at a far greater pace than ever before, and naturally, this is aided by technology. So, time and space, the compression of that, the spatial aspect of that is the first dimension. The second dimension is the geographical reach. So, when we look at distance, the world is shrinking, or the world is getting smaller. About 700 years ago, or perhaps even 400 years ago, the world as we knew it was pretty much the village that we lived in, or the town that we lived in. That was the beginning and ending of our world. But now the world has shrunk to a degree that uh, progress in civil aviation and movement has allowed people to view the world as a whole, and therefore globalization is also at a conceptual level. So, when we talk about the geographical conceptual reach, what we mean is that people now view the world as a connected, unified space where travel and speed accompany each other and can get a person to one place to another, and more importantly, there is a accelerated sense of time and space. The third dimension looks at the movement of goods, the movement of trade, and globalization is also the economic aspect of it is the rapid pace at which uh, companies are able to now set up bases in other countries. There is an international flow of money and finance. There are MNCs, multinational companies, which are able to have a global outreach. So, a scholar argues that there is McDonaldization of the world, whereby the number of McDonald's, the American company which serves the trademark burger, fries, and Coke, are indicative of the rapid invasion, the rapid access granted to American capitalist companies. So, whether it is Nike, whether it is Gap, whether it is several these big brands, there is a global feel to it. There is a global reach to it, and the fourth component, of course, is language. Hollywood and the English language are very much part of the globalizing process, where a certain culture has a premium value compared to others. And over here we look at how English is the lingua franca of the world. It is the language of power as much as the language which one would use to get around in in other parts of the world. So, we've looked at globalization as a compression of distance and time, as a conceptual understanding of the world, as the access of MNCs into foreign territories, and finally as an individual understanding of the world. And over here we see that culture, there is a global culture which is based on the English language, which is based on the use of technology, whether it is WhatsApp or Gmail, and there is a certain global community which is utilizing these commonalities. Now, so far globalization seems great, but is there a dark underpinning? Is there a darkness underlying this optimism about the flow of goods, the transfer of technology, the flow of people, objects, what is the darker side, and why is globalization the subject of such a heated debate. So let's pause by looking at perhaps the darkest uh, instance of the possibilities of globalization. And of course, I'm not suggesting that this sums up what globalization is, but just to understand the inherent inequalities upon which globalization is based. Now, the instance that I'm referring to is often called the Bhopal Gas Tragedy, and this was the world's worst industrial accident which took place in 1984. The pesticide company by the name of Union Carbide Limited had set up a company in Bhopal, and on the night of 3rd December 1984 there was a massive leak of methyl isocyanate leading to the tragic death of thousands of people. Now, the question is not of the industrial accident, but the question is that of the responsibility and the consequences of an American company which was later acquired by Dow, uh, setting up base in a third world country, causing an accident and the consequences of that. After the accident, Union Carbide pulled out, and the administration of that company fled to America, which ensued in a long legal battle. But eventually, after it was acquired by Dow, the compensation given to the victims and survivors of the Bhopal gas tragedy was amounted to a meaningless sum, especially after the many years and the long battle, the long legal battle. So the question which arises is, who are the beneficiaries of globalization? Is globalization a new process? Is there something new about it? Is globalization another form of westernization? Let's not forget that in the 1960s, Nkrumah of Ghana qualified this as neo-colonialism just at the start of the setting up of the Bretton Woods institutions. So when we look at globalization and examine it as a global transformation, and we look at the emergence of global cities, as Saskia Sassen, who is a well-known writer on globalization, will tell us that globalization is positioned upon transformations of time and space, but at the same time it builds upon certain global hierarchies between white and brown on the basis of race, on the basis of gender between men and women, on the basis of location between the Western world and the developing countries. So globalization is a transformation, is a global transformation which is positioned upon existing hierarchies of race, gender, and geography. And in order to understand globalization better, it is therefore necessary to look into the historical antecedents of globalization to see what is globalization, what is globalism, and what is new about globalization. So we're going to start by looking at an article by Jan and Skolte, and this article is called What is Global About Globalization? Is it really something new, is the question that he's asking. And Skolte argues that there isn't anything new about it because it has a long historical precedence to it. So when we say that the world is coming together, we do know that for thousands of years human civilizations have reached out to each other, and there have been global networks of trade, of knowledge, of culture, And what we see as globalization is a part of that very long process over hundreds of years of people learning from each other. So, just to give a small, short historical narrative of globalization, the birth of Christianity, the birth of Islam in the 8th century, the Crusades in the 12th and the 13th century between Islam and Christianity, the conquering of Constantinople by the Muslims and the conversion of Constantinople into Istanbul, the spread of Mughal of Islamic empires, whether it's the Ottoman Empire in what is now present day Turkey, the Mughal Empire in South Asia, obviously challenged the Christian hegemony till that point of time, and also aided the spread of religions and cultures beyond boundaries. So, if we look at globalization as a spread of people and the interconnection of people, this is a process which has been ongoing, and we've come now to the 16th century, to the Mughal Empire. In 1707, we know that Aurangzeb dies, and it is also around this time that we see that European imperialism begins as has a global outlook, and it is Western Europe imperial tendencies which stem into the acquisition of South Asian, African and American colonies by Western European states such as Portugal, Spain, France, Italy, Germany being the last, and of course we know the Dutch empires, the Portuguese empires were one of the earliest, and followed by the British Empire. Now, how is this related to globalization? Colonialism and colonization were that process which forcibly built, pulled the world in together in the form of empires. And this history of imperialism is extremely important when we look at globalization, which is positioned as a neutral process. But what I'm trying to draw your attention to is that global transformations often carry with them the ideologies and ideas of the powerful, and globalization therefore must not be seen as a neutral process, but in every epoch global transformations have been brought about by imperial powers, and imperialism is perhaps the that structure which aids the fastest spread of people, ideas and technology, and colonialism does just that in the 16th to the 20th century. So, American imperialism in Cuba and Philippines, we've looked at the Spanish empires, the Portuguese empires, were empires which spread European languages, European technologies, and most importantly, as Anthony Giddens would tell us, modernity. Modernity as that ideal, as that idea of the rational mind conquering nature, modernity as that scientific outlook, and modernity as that belief in the ability of the human to control or to dominate. And of course, all of this is linked to the 16th century Enlightenment project of the celebration of science. And those of you interested can look up Francis Bacon as a person who celebrated and upheld the value neutral project of science. So, what we can see so far is globalization is linked to a history of power and domination, and the process of pulling the world together has been brought about forcibly by the forces of colonization, and colonization has been responsible to the fact that I am now speaking in English, is irredeemably linked to India having been a former British colony. So, when we look at globalization, we must look at it with a view of historicizing it, which is what Rostenberg tells us, but also contextualizing it in the present period. Now, if colonialism was the unabashed domination and control of one power over another, the term globalization doesn't certainly carry that value ladenness of colonialism. So, but what is globalization and what is the economic aspect of that, and why do uh, critics of globalization point out its underlying ideological domain? For that, we need to look at the Bretton Woods institutions, which is something that we have been centering upon right from the start, and look at the nature of economic globalization upon which every other globalization rests. So, when we look at globalization, if we look at it as the coming together of, or the invisibilizing or the fuzzing borders of nation states, the first principle of that is economics, the flow of goods and people, whether it's trade or migration. And for that, we must pause and look at the Bretton Woods institutions and to see the havoc and the changes that these institutions have brought about in the name of development, and we will give it uh, the benefit of being well-meaning institutions in our evaluation of the Bretton Woods. So now what we're going to do is we're going to look at the Bretton Woods institutions and see the link between globalization and economic flows and financial flows and these institutions which have aided this economic globalization. In our examination of globalization, therefore, what is truly striking are the diverse sets of opinions on the phenomena itself. So, as we have been seeing, globalization is intrinsically linked to the process of colonialism. Colonization allowed certain colonizer states to benefit from the process, and by the end of the decolonization process, there was a distinction between North and South in global politics, where the North are categorized as first world wealthy states, and the South states are developing, undemocratic, marked by poverty and unemployment. The basic point here is that when we look at the onset of globalization, it began on existing hierarchies, inequalities and injustices, and it is here that globalization's design, the manner in which it is pitted as being neutral and natural is what needs to be questioned. So just to run over that again, globalization, unlike colonization, is positioned as a process which is flowing quite naturally, very much like a gentle stream, and is benefiting people around the world. However, scholars of IR incisively question the naturalness, the gentle flow to globalization, and question the very neutrality of it. So, before looking into the underlying forces which have compelled globalization, I am going to be looking at two scholars who view it very differently, and then we will proceed to see what the bone of contention is, the heart of the matter, and that of course are the Bretton Woods institutions. The first scholar we are looking at is Joseph Nye, who we have met before when we've looked at liberalism. Joseph Nye also championed the concept of soft power, but right now we are more interested in looking at his observations about globalization. And Nye positions globalization as a form of American domination. Nye is an American himself, and he argues that America won the Cold War precisely because it embedded liberalism in institutions and structures, which facilitated the growth of American capitalism, allowed American companies to spread far and wide, allowed American capitalism, technology, people, ideas to buttress the American domination in global politics. Nye's equation of globalization with American power is a nod to the success, if you could call it that, to the Bretton Woods institutions. And what I mean by that is the fact that nearly all sovereign states, perhaps barring North Korea, are members of these extremely influential financial institutions, and we will be seeing how they are influential and in what manner they question the very nature of the sovereign state. So, Nye's argument unravels and reveals the clear equation between globalization and Americanization, and therefore when there are questions about globalization being a form of American power, they are of course fairly accurate. But of course Nye upholds it as a triumph of liberalism, of liberal institutionalism, and we have a completely different set of ideas from Negri and Hart, Antonio Negri and Michael Hart, who are scholars who view globalization as empire, empire with a capital E. And to quote them, the starting sentence of their essay on this is, empire is materializing before our very eyes. Now, the description of globalization as empire again reminds us as to how production and labor is at the core of understanding any society and any international economy, any set of market and exchange systems. But Negri and Hart are telling us that this is an empire, but this is an empire not like the ones we have seen in the past. So we have seen the British Empire, the French Empire, the Spanish Empire, the Portuguese Empire, and Negri and Hart tell us that even though these empires were ruthless, appropriative, exploitative, domineering and dominating, they existed on a certain territorialization, which meant that there was a clear understanding of the center, of the heart of control, and the colony which was controlled and leached off. But they tell us that the American empire, which is of what we call globalization, is different, and it is different because the linkages of power are invisible in a world where we do not see the source of power. Instead, it's amorphous, it exists, but we do not see it in the same ruthless way in which colonialism exercised its power. In effect, Negri and Hart are telling us that globalization is far more insidious than colonialism because the structures of power are invisible, and instead it is couched in terms of the sovereign state, acceptance of terms and conditions, and volition and mutual dependency system. In short, globalization is positioned as a neutral value system when in effect it is a form of domination and control, and that is precisely what makes it harder to resist. So while colonization could be contested ideologically, militarily, conceptually, globalization is harder to resist because there is no site, identifiable site of power to contest it. So what we can see is that there is a certain general understanding and recognition that perhaps globalization is not natural or neutral, but this becomes most evident when we look at the forces behind globalization in the 20th century, and of course those are the Bretton Woods institutions. So what we've seen so far is that we've looked at multiple ways of looking at globalization. David Held would say that it is the compression of time and space. There is a spatial dimension to it. Conceptually, it is the rapid movement, the accelerated space of the flow of goods and objects, ideas and people. On the other hand, we also have a starker view of it in the opinion of Negri and Hart, who identify it as another kind of an empire, but as an empire that we have never witnessed before. Again, Joseph Nye tells us that the American success of the Cold War lay in its ability to set up financial institutions, and that is a form of American hegemony. So in effect, what we can see is that economic control is the source of America's power, its superpower nature, and it explains why America survived the Cold War, why the Soviet Union collapsed, and most importantly, the continuing hegemony of American capitalism. So a wide number of Marxist scholars have contested this, and you can have a look at David Harvey, Leo Panitch, and a whole range of Marxist scholars who have outlined the capitalistic nature of the international political economy. But this will become a little clearer when we look at the Bretton Woods institutions. So the year is 1944, and there is an extremely influential economist by the name of John Maynard Keynes. His theory of economics is often called Keynesianism or Keynesian economics. And fundamentally, Keynes, who was a British economist who studied at Cambridge, influenced considerably what went into the making of the Bretton Woods institutions. Now let's remind ourselves of what these institutions are. These are being set up even while the war is going on. So the year is 1944. The war has not ended, and a set of 44 nations assemble in order to decide the financial architecture of the future. And it is here that Keynes is at his arrogant best. Perhaps 22 of those 44 nations did not speak English, did not know the consequences of those actions, and nonetheless, it is at this time that agreements are signed which pave the way for the emergence of these institutions. Keynes very famously describes this as a monkey madhouse, or a madhouse full of monkeys, indicating that perhaps the members of the Bretton Woods conference were not aware, but nonetheless it is at this time that certain ideas of Keynes are taking place, and we will look at those closely now. These ideas are also called the Washington Consensus, and that's a term very frequently used when we look at the WTO and the IMF and the World Bank. Now, these three institutes were set up as institutes which would restructure the international financial architecture. But the question is how? How were they going to do that? The IMF and the World Bank were designed to be lenders of money to poor developing countries. So, they were designed to provide financial stability to countries who were recently decolonized. But it is here that this money which was being offered came with a certain condition, and this is often called, like I said, the Washington Consensus. It's also often called SAPs, that is Structural Adjustment Program. But fundamentally, borrowing money from the World Bank came upon on the basis of certain conditions. The first condition of a borrower state would be to lower tariff barriers in order to aid the free flow of trade, which means that a state would not be allowed to be protectionist and protect its economy. Instead, they were encouraged to reduce their tariff barriers. The second bit was to reduce public expenditure in hospitals, schools, for education, in healthcare. It meant rolling back the state. Now, the term rolling back the state means that the state would step back from domains which are considered to be of public concern, and of course, we mean health and education here, infrastructure, things which are the rights of the citizens. And when the state rollbacks comes the third element of allowing the free competition between private players in the domestic arena. Now, this is called liberalization. It is a form of the state abdicating from its fundamental roles of public welfare. But these were conditions upon which the World Bank and the IMF lent money, which also meant that borrowing states were more inclined to borrow money to fix issues, and in exchange they would often end up accepting these changes which would only make their conditions worse. So, the World Bank's slogan is that its dream is to end poverty. Similarly, the IMF is committed to financial stability. But following the decades of the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s and 90s, the World Bank began to come under tremendous criticism for its projects which were funded thoughtlessly with little regard for the people who were involved in it. Two examples which I could give right now. The first is the Pelorocenta project in Brazil, which was a 1500-kilometer long highway to be constructed in Brazil, which was to connect highly populated spaces with the Amazon forest. And as the years progressed, it became increasingly clear that this project has not been well thought out. And as time passed, it became very evident that far from achieving its end of employment, it had actually increased poverty levels, and there was a big breakout of malaria. And the World Bank rationale to fund such a project came under severe criticism. Similarly, the making the Narmada Dam in the Narmada Valley was a project which began in 1985. It was a project which devoted little thought to the people who were the 4,000 people to be displaced at the time of the project. There was little understanding of the number of people who would be affected, the forests which would be ruined by the dam, and the social and the ecological costs of this project. Nonetheless, the World Bank persisted in funding projects ostensibly for social and economic welfare and progress with little regard for the human impact. And ironically enough, data revealed that far from eradicating poverty, states which had taken loans from the World Bank and IMF were actually poorer than what they were when they took the loans. Now, these inputs point to the fact as to how privatization and the inroad of private companies were detrimental to the growth of these developing economies, and as to how privatization aided the penetration of these markets and allowed for greater profits for America, but fewer profits and fewer welfare benefits for poor countries. Secondly, wherever there was a large transfer of fund, charges of corruption often came up, and in effect, by the late 1990s, it was found that severe charges of malnutrition, poverty, unemployment, degradation were rampant among states which had been beneficiaries of this, which only made it clear that far from eradicating malnutrition, poverty, unemployment, the World Bank was actively achieving them. It is also here that we see that within globalization, the state has been pushed to recede. So, the word recede means to withdraw, and it is here that we also see the widespread the AIDS and the HIV epidemic, which was first identified in Africa and then spread rapidly, was on account of the limited public expenditure on primary healthcare, primary education, and primary infrastructure. So, what this tells us is that globalization is a process which has been pushed and hoisted upon the world with a clear economic agenda, and that economic agenda favors capitalist countries such as America, and this is a form of American hegemony where the World Bank and the IMF and the WTO, in seemingly neutral ways, in seemingly polite civil ways, enmesh and engage states within the net of the international political economy. As the United Nations Millennium Goals were being evaluated, it was found that social indicators of life had progressively deteriorated in developing countries, and the indexes of the quality of life had considerably weakened. So, questions of education, healthcare, employment were considerably worse from where they were 50 years ago, again pointing to the cleavages made by globalization. So, what we can see essentially is that globalization is a process which is fundamentally economical and based on economics, and it is one which widens the social and material inequalities between the North and the South. But where the IMF and the World Bank were institutions which began functioning in 1944, it is the third institution, the World Trade Organization, also known as its predecessor GATT, the General Agreement on Trade and Tariff, that truly highlights the sharp differences between the developing and the developed world in the argument on globalization. So we're going to shift our focus to GATT, which was signed in 1947 as an agreement. It was a piece of paper, and between 1947 and 1995 there were over 7 rounds of meetings, negotiations and discussions about the shape of this organization, which was to facilitate trade. So the Bretton Woods institutions are institutions which organize financial architecture. The IMF was imagined to be a fund to regulate stability. The World Bank was imagined to be a bank to help states in their post-war reconstruction. And the GATT was imagined to be the organization to facilitate free and fair trade. Unlike the first two, the GATT took the longest time to gain a consensus, almost 50 years, and it is the last round which began in 1989 and went up to 1994. Sorry, 1984 to 1990. 1986 to 1994, that highlighted the cost of trade between developed and developing countries. When it was formed in 1995, the World Trade Organization represented the most comprehensive organization to facilitate trade. When the GATT was envisaged, it was envisaged as an organization to link trade, but by the time the Uruguay round, which took place between 86 and 94, was complete, there were 3 new elements which were part of WTO. So the WTO is this mammoth, gigantic organization which aids free trade, but again the question arises, free means, what does free trade mean when the world that we are negotiating in is already marked by inequality and divided along race, gender and location. So in 1995, when the WTO finally comes into shape, it is formally an international organization with the real headquarters in Rapad in Switzerland, and it has, amongst other things, also included 3 areas which were not originally in it, and that is GATS, General Agreement on Trade in Services, TRIPS, which is the agreement on intellectual property rights, and the third is TRIMS, which is trade related investment measures. Now these 3 areas are essentially contentious, because when we talk about trade in services, services could be of individuals as well as the people who are providing those services, which in effect means migration. Now while we are looking at these 3 set of contentious issues, one finds that there are stark differences between what is to be achieved from developing countries and what developed countries hope to achieve. And under GATT, a fundamental principle which was established was the principle of consensus, which means that even if one state disagrees, a consensus would not be taken, and this is often called the MFN, the most favored nation, which fundamentally means that each state has a right to veto. And that also explains as to why the negotiations over WTO took such a long time, because it meant having everybody on board. While the IMF and the World Bank have weighted voting, which means that voting takes place on the basis of the amount of funds you have deposited in the funds, which means that the wealthiest states have the greatest weightage of votes. The World the WTO functions on one vote per state. So as a consequence, the WTO as we see today covers several areas which were not originally designed to be in the GATT, and these are widespread, which they include services, intellectual property rights, trade related investment measures, which only means that a great number of trade is going to take place on areas where developing countries are already have got the shorter end of the stick. Two issues which are of crucial importance for agriculture and textiles, but a lot of this requires looking into the history of the WTO at closer detail, and there are a few books that would help you out in that. The first is Amrita Narlikar's observations about developing countries within the WTO, and of course a wonderful book which will give you a rich overview of the Bretton Woods institutions is the book by Richard Peat called The Unholy Trinity, and both of these allow one to see the economic aspect, the financial design of the world that we inhabit. So, taking a broad survey of where we've gotten so far, one can see as to how globalization is a disputed area precisely because there is a certain design, there is a certain intention, and there is a certain manifestation to the nature of globalization. So, we can list out a number of things, number of observations about globalization. The first thing that globalization is an area with multiple dimensions, including language, culture, society, politics, as well as economics. This lecture has focused more on the economic aspect of globalization, but of course globalization indicates the current most powerful state in the system, and that of course is America. The language that we speak, the food that we eat is increasingly Americanized, and of course one sees this more concretely after the First World War, after the end of the Cold War. So what we see is that globalization is certainly not a neutral process. There is a certain economic aspect to it, and that is exactly why it is a hotly contested space. So while you have the critics of globalization such as Negri and Hart, amongst others David Harvey, you also have defenders of globalization, and the book that comes to mind is Jagdish Bhagwati's In Defense of Globalization, which looks into the material transformations brought about by globalization. But when we sum up our examination of globalization, it does reveal that there are material inequalities which have only been heightened by globalization. When one looks at the material, ideational control, we see that there is a gender disparity, which means that the three institutions we have been mentioning have been dominated by men. Nearly 89% of these bureaucratic structures are designed and controlled by men, which also means that half the world's population is not adequately thought of or considered in these economic making structures. The third and the most vital area which globalization draws our attention to is the relationship between globalization and the nation state and the state. As we have seen, the Washington Consensus is a corrosive force on the nation's sovereignty, which means that the nation's control over its infrastructure, its public expenditure is being persuasively pushed back. At the same time, one sees that the state is negotiating, cooperating, also being transformed in its parley, in its negotiations with other international organizations. And therefore, one wonders, for instance, there's an influential scholar, Kenichi Omaha, who argues that we are now reaching a borderless world. But when we celebrate a borderless world, we also must question about the ability of people to move in those borderless worlds. Are we only talking about people who then have a passport, who have the ability to move across spaces with sophistication and ease? And as Rustam Barucha reminds us, that in the talk of borderlessness and globalization, there are some who are privileged enough to move seamlessly from one space to another, and at the same time globalization disables, disempowers some groups of people from doing the same. And of course, who I have in mind are women, lower paid migrants, blue collar workers, manual workers, who often find globalization to be a nameless force, a force beyond their reach, an invisible force which shapes their lives, controls them in a manner in which they cannot respond to. So we end today's lecture by looking at globalization with a question mark about its future, about its contestations, about our complicity, about the state's complicity in it. And of course, that leads us to the last lecture of this course, which is the nation state itself. How has globalization transformed the essential unit of the state? As we look at international politics today, what is the relationship between states and IOs and other private forces like MNCs, technology and data? These are pressing questions which invite us to delve deeper, swim harder against the tide in order to examine questions which impact our everyday lives and, more importantly, our future. With that, I end today's class, and in the next class we will be looking at the state, the formation of the state, and where the state is heading to in this globalizing and allegedly borderless world. Thank you.